Hello, Peter.
Yeah.
I've been so looking forward to this interview. We spoke a few days ago. I wish we'd recorded that conversation.
Me too. It's always the way.
And
Always.
my fear is that this won't be anywhere near as exciting, but let's see if we can remember everything we talked about the other day.
Yes.
But firstly, Peter, could you tell everyone where in the world you are and what you do?
Okay, so I'm I'm actually in Rochford, which is a little village kind of halfway between Southend and Rayleigh, in the south of Essex. So I attend Rayleigh Vineyard, where David and Laura Smith are the pastors. That's about 15 minutes away from where I am. I work in Southend. I'm a therapist, and when you're a therapist, you open the door and you treat whatever walks through the door, as it were. But by speciality, I specialise in trauma. So if people ask me, I say I'm a trauma therapist, but in real life, I do some trauma and some just regular therapy, as it were, anxiety, depression, OCD, grief, loss, all the usuals. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for letting me interview you, because we chatted the other day. So Dave and Laura, your pastor's friends, were telling me how helpful you've been with them. And I've been doing a series of interviews with people. I actually interviewed David McGregor the other day, he and his church went through all the earthquakes in Christchurch. And that was fascinating, hearing what they'd learned and what they're putting into practice now. So the reason to interview you was, you were helpful to Dave and Laura as pastors, and when I talked to you the other day, it was amazing. I learned so much. So I'm hoping that from this interview, we'll have some, going to dig in, and I'm going to ask you some questions about what trauma is and therapy and how that, and your thoughts on what's going on at the minute that everyone's going through in this crisis, because just as a resource for people and to help them. Okay. So first question then, if we start with trauma, what is it?
Yeah, it's a tough question, isn't it? I mean, partly it's semantics. Different people use the word in different ways. Say, oh, that was really traumatic, or when actually what they mean is very stressful, or there was lots of anxiety involved, or something like that. For me, a sort of a rule of thumb is, if something happened back then, but you're still feeling it right now, that's trauma. So most of us will go through traumatic experiences in our lives, lose people, or we'll have a close call here, or we were bullied at school and that was bad. But when we think about it, the brain's processed it, we can think about it, we can talk about it, it doesn't really matter. Some people, these things happen, we haven't been able to process it for whatever reason, often because it's one trauma on top of another trauma on top of another, and it just reminds us of all the original traumas that we weren't able to process. And so normally, as a rule of thumb, I say to people, trauma is something that if you think about it now, or particularly if it's imposing itself on you now, where you don't want to think about it, but you're having flashbacks, or you're triggered, or you're having nightmares or whatever, and when it comes with all the emotion, all the thoughts, all the feelings, everything, you're re-experiencing it, then trauma. Normally two types of trauma. So one's caused by a single event trauma, would be like a road traffic accident or something. And then often more common, I've found, is trauma that's built up over a period of time. So for example, if you were bullied at school, then each individual incident of being bullied might not have been that bad. You might not have been bullied every single day, but waking up every day, year after year after year, fearful, scared, terrified, cold sweats, sick in the pit of your stomach, that sort of cumulative effect, that can create trauma. And I think probably, to talk about what's going on right now.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, what do you think is going to happen?
Well, I think if people are traumatised by it, my guess is it will be because of that, living in that heightened state of fight or flight, the panic response. So if I'm panicking about my kids are going to die, I'm going to die, my parents are going to die, everyone I know is going to die. Whether they do or they don't, if I wake up and I'm 24/7 with that heightened state of anxiety, the adrenaline, all the stuff pumping through my body, if that goes on long enough, it is traumatic to experience that. But if that endures, so technically speaking, we won't know whether it's trauma or not for maybe 6 months after, because a lot of that stuff will be processed when we go back to normal, whatever normal may or may not be. A lot of that stuff will be processed. But for some people, 6 months, a year, longer afterwards, they will still be having flashbacks. They'll still be getting cold sweats. They'll still be having nightmares. And that would be considered trauma.
Yeah. Gosh, okay. And then some people are going to have immediate trauma, aren't they? Like, well, would it be loss of a job? Well, definitely loss of a loved one if someone dies from.
Yeah, and I think trauma, again, different people respond in different ways, don't they? So we can talk in generalities, but if you put 100 people in exactly the same situation, if you're really good, you'll get 100 different responses to it. So it is a personal thing how people respond to it. But often trauma comes with a sense of shock, unexpected. It comes with a sense of overwhelm. It comes with a sense of being out of control. One of the most traumatic thoughts, of course, is I am going to die, not in that generalised, we're all going to die, Jason, but in that actually right here, right now, this is it, my number's up, I'm going to die right now. That's a really traumatic thought. So for people maybe who catch COVID and then are in hospital, but then they recover, they could still be traumatised by that, but obviously losing other people. And that's where you get into an issue of, is it trauma? Is it grief? Is it loss? Is it, because bereavement itself is always painfully sad, whenever it happens, whether it's expected or not. I've lost both my parents. My dad had cancer for 4 years, way too long. My mum was diagnosed on the Thursday, went into a coma on the Tuesday and died 2 days later, way too short. So there's never a good time to die, and there's never a good way to die, really, although there are better and worse. But sometimes grief, again, can go into trauma if we don't process it properly. And of course, what we can't do now, if people do die, we can't go to the funeral. We can't have the usual grieving. We can't have the wake. We can't all gather together. We can't all comfort each other and support each other in the way that we would normally. We have to experience it on our own. I've got a friend whose dad died recently, nothing to do with COVID, but it happened during the lockdown. He couldn't go to the funeral, so that's obviously added another layer to his grieving process. He can't go around and see his mum. He can't, all those things. So it's kind of layer upon layer upon layer, isn't it? That experiencing now, which is very different than we would have done 6 months ago.
So what can we do now, knowing that, and then what do you think we're going to have to do later to attend to that?
Yeah, easy questions you're asking. You're easy.
Yeah, they are.
I think fundamentally, obviously, a lot of this stuff is all the usual stuff that we would do. So if we're talking about grief, loss, trauma, whatever it might be, a lot of it is to do with support mechanisms. Do we have a support mechanism? Do we have people around us that we can talk to, who we can offload? Do we have somewhere we can go with it? That's always one of the questions that we ask as therapists. Who are your support mechanism? Do you have one? And often people in therapy don't, which is one of the main reasons why they are in therapy, because they don't have someone they can go and talk to. They don't have somewhere they can offload. And of course that becomes more difficult, particularly if you're living alone, haven't got a partner you can talk to about this stuff. You can't go to church, you can't go to small group, you can't meet in, all the people you would normally meet with. So it's finding ways that you can do that to try and replace these things. But the problem is that some of these things you can't. Sometimes if you're grieving, there's nothing better than just giving someone a hug, is there? Sorry, no physical contact. Even if some therapists are still working and have continued to work. But again, you've got to keep your social distance. And it's the same if you do visit somebody, if you did decide, I want to go and see someone because they've gone through this terrible loss, get more than 6 feet close to them, don't hug them, don't touch them, don't, all those kind of things. So it will be difficult, it will. And then part of that comes down to us as individuals. How can we cope with that ourselves? And all the research on grief, really, all we know is two things. One is, if you lose someone or something that you loved, you will grieve, whether you like it or not. And the other thing we know is grief is better out than in. But apart from that, we don't really know a great deal about it. It's normal, it's natural, it happens. You have to go through the process. When it's done, it will be done. But how long that will be and how that will work, there's lots of other variables in that. But it is a very difficult time. It is, because people's normal structures have been removed. The normal things that we would do to cope with life have been removed. We're trying to find alternatives like Zoom, obviously, and other things. But it is different. And I think once it's over, people are kind of in that lockdown mentality, just get through, just get through. Once it's over and we can begin to breathe out, I think a lot of this stuff will come out then. So whatever we may or may not be going through now, from a professional point of view, I think the general consensus is that 6 months, a year more afterwards will still be mopping up a lot of the stuff that actually is rooted in things that happened while we were all in lockdown.
Yeah, we're anticipating as a church, like a lot of people are, mental health needs, self-harm, the need for referrals to therapy, talking, relationships, courses, integration with things locally, support things in the church. I mean, spiritually, I think of things of lament. And I've noticed people talking about that, and notice in scripture when God's people go through the most awful circumstances and there isn't time to probably grieve because they have to get to somewhere to safety. Thinking of the escaping from Egypt would be an example. Lament later, that processing as a community before God, and the legitimacy of what you've lost and how it's affected you together and before God, I think. And our church traditions are probably similar. We're not really good at lamenting from an evangelical background, and I think we're going to have to lean into that. Have you? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the two things there that particularly strike, one is to be able to do it as a community, and one is to legitimate it. That feeling of, yeah, we are all struggling. It is all difficult. It is unprecedented. Much as that word has been overused, we don't have anything, or most of us haven't lived through anything similar. But again, it does tap into theology, doesn't it? Do we have a theology of suffering? Do we have a theology where fundamentally God's promises that he will be with us when the storm comes, when the floods rage, not if, but when, Jesus in the Beatitudes, when you're persecuted, not if you're persecuted. But, and a lot of this, to tie this in with a therapeutic frame of mind, is that in cognitive behavioural therapy in particular, it's what we would call core beliefs, those fundamental things that we believe then affect how we think, how we feel, how we behave. And so a core belief is, I am rubbish. That's going to affect how you think and feel and behave, that kind of stuff. It's a similar thing in church circles with Christianity, that depending on what our beliefs are, our core beliefs, more specifically our theology around lament, around suffering, around loss, around, I became a Christian so that my life would be happy all day, every day. God owns me, it's going to be a rose garden, it's all marvellous stuff. And then one day something happens and God doesn't turn up and magically, wave his magic wand over his well. What does that challenge my faith? Is my faith built upon God will answer all my prayers all the time or else? Or is it built upon this is life, that God's promised to be with us in it? He never promised that it would be easy. He never promised it wouldn't be bad. He never promised. And also, not being funny. I mean, one of the things I saw very, very early on was our grandparents were asked to fight in 2 world wars. We've been asked to stay home and wash our hands. It's that thing that it's all relative, isn't it? I've got a friend out in South Africa, lives near one of the townships. They're just waiting for it to go there because it will just it will just be the end. That's how he summed it up. But people who live a hand-to-mouth existence, I'm telling them lockdown for 12 weeks. They're not going to get furloughed. If they don't work, they don't eat. He's afraid that will all end in rioting, looting. The death rate will be much higher. For those of us over here, we have it comparatively easy. But at the same time, that's not to belittle that it is very difficult for people. And so it's getting that balance and perspective, theologically, philosophically, personally, psychologically, it ties into all of those things, doesn't it? And because we've never been through it before, we're all scrabbling to find answers and understand it and find a way through it, when there is no roadmap for it, is there?
No, there isn't. I'm just thinking there, so, we're all going through it. I think that's one of the big differences, isn't it? Because a lot of the time you can go through life thinking that everything should be okay, having a belief about God that doesn't work in a crisis, because it happens to other people. I'm always talking to guys in our church, say, why is it okay to believe in God when bad things happen to other people? Why is it harder when it happens to your friends? And why do you suddenly have to think that through when it happens to you? You know, that because we just can carry on with life. But now we're all, you know, it's up close for everyone. So I hear you there saying, Peter, that it's, you know, on the one hand, we've got to validate people's real loss and suffering, but also be able to put it in perspective at the same time. So let's dig into the theology and the belief bit a bit more. I've got a friend who went to a friend's funeral, someone who sadly had committed suicide not long after one of his kids' weddings, and she went there, and when she came back, she said one of the really sad things, she met all these people she'd become a Christian with in her, you know, late teens, early 20s, was that, you know, sort of 30 years later, their anger and disappointment about life and God was the saddest thing, not the funeral, because, you know, they just all assumed they endlessly go on holiday and have amazing houses and amazing marriages and live great lives. And of course, people had died, people had got ill, people got divorced. And she said, you know, because she remembers when she became a Christian, she's actually been through a lot herself, been through cancer multiple times and had to deal with that. And she just said to me, she said, I remember being there and I'm thinking, what did you think we signed up for when we became Christians? And there's what we say we think being a Christian is, but what we actually really expect life to be about. And I think this is just forcing a lot of us, isn't it? Exactly like you said, to go, what do I really believe about God? Why should bad things not happen to me? That makes sense.
It does make sense, yes. So I was expecting.
Your question. Well, the question would be, because I know you do that. I guess I mean, you're counselling, you're doing therapy with lots of people, but when you talk to Christians in particular, do you see that realization that they go, well, yeah, I sort of knew that, but I didn't ever think it would happen to me? How do you think we get there?
Yeah, I mean, well, that's an enormous question, isn't it? How did we actually get here? I always think, I had a conversation with somebody the other day, and we were talking about, he'd been praying for his church. He said while he was praying, he suddenly just burst into tears. And he'd had that kind of experience, you know, when you're sort of inside your own head, but you're aware of what you're thinking. And he was aware, he was like, I'm crying, and I don't know why I'm crying. What am I crying about? And just sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. When it was all over, he was kind of thinking about it, processing it, reflecting on it theologically, one eye on God, one eye on what's happening. How does God inform what's happened? How does what's happened inform my understanding of God? All those kind of questions. And he said the only way he could really express it was to write a poem and draw a picture, which he didn't really do, but that was all he could. That was the only way he could get it out of his head. And I think in a sense, to my mind, that's how the Bible gets written. All these things happened to the Israelites, it happened to the early Christians. They thought about it, they reflected on it theologically. You know, what does this tell us about God? What does God tell us about this? And then what they've produced is wisdom literature, narrative, poetry, psalms, letters, just the whole mix that the Bible is. But it's come out of experience, isn't it? Reflecting on it, and then all of just the whole broad landscape that the Bible is. Now, I don't know about you, but we were encouraged when we were growing up to underline key verses, you know, highlight them in our Bibles, that kind of thing when we were growing up. It would be interesting to go through people's Bibles and see whether they've highlighted, take up your cross daily, sell everything you have and give it to the poor, you know, when you're persecuted, those kind of verses. Nobody wants to read those kind of verses, do we? On that. But the verses like, I know the plans I have for you, all that kind of, all the good stuff. So it's that question of, is that because it's being preached from the pulpit? And I know you're very interested in church and culture, you know, the consumer church. I go to a church because it's there to meet my needs. And does this church meet my needs? If it doesn't, I'll go to another one. Does that put pressure on pastors to preach a kind of, you know, to preach that kind of gospel of, you know, come to us and it'll all be lovely. You know, if you stood up on a Sunday for the next 6 weeks and just preached, you know, it's all going to be suffering. It's all going to be lament. It's all going to be grief and loss. But don't worry, God loves you. He'll be with you in it. You know, how many people would leave your church? How many people would that draw to your church? And I think partly there's that pressure for people who run church. I don't run a church, so it doesn't, I don't know. But my guess is there's a certain pressure to be thinking, do I need to keep these people happy? Do I need to tell them what they want to hear? versus that tension of, do I need to tell them the truth, which is actually life can be hard. There's that great bit in Hebrews, isn't there, where he lists all the great heroes of the faith and all the great miracles God has done to save everybody, and then sort of in the second half of the verse then talks about all the people who died for the faith and were tortured and whatever. And it's that the Bible is, I think, is very balanced and very brutally realistic and honest. But that question is it being taught like that? Are we receiving it like that? Do we read it like that? What kind of books do we read? What kind of theology do we study? What kind of, are we putting ourselves in an echo chamber where all we hear is all the lovely stuff bouncing back off the walls? I don't want to hear the bad news. But I think that's also reflected in real life, isn't it? It's reflected in life outside the church. I see a lot of people where, I know when we talked earlier, we talked about Viktor Frankl, who invented a therapy called logotherapy or meaning therapy, because his experience, his belief was that something like 95% of the clients he saw, their real issue was their lives lacked meaning and purpose. And if we don't think about meaning and purpose, what am I here for? Then when the bigger things happen, like we have to confront the fact that we might die in a pandemic, or people we love might die in a pandemic. We don't like to talk about death, of course. In our culture, the Victorians, they always talked about death because death was part of life, but they never talked about sex. In our culture, all we talk about is sex, but we don't want to talk about death. And so we're not really prepared, I think, culturally to have those kind of conversations anyway. And so when something like the pandemic comes and we are confronted with our own mortality, well, we're not equipped to do that. But I think, where did that come from and why? I think that's a huge conversation. That's way beyond my remit.
Yeah, for me, it's a perfect storm. A post Second World War extended period of time where everyone expects and tells the next generation you'll more and have more, and life expectancy increases and lifestyles, just things that our grandparents could never have imagined. And then that just becomes the norm. And I think we just don't have a theology of suffering as individuals. Even if our churches teach it, we live in a world that tells you, no, you can avoid all of this. I think a lot of Christians actually know their Bibles, and they know that suffering is supposed to be a normal part of Christian life. I think a lot of people have just managed to avoid it. My daughter said something. Probably shouldn't quote her, should I? Don't worry, she'll never watch this. She said, her generation. Yeah, she's an older millennial, and she said, "Dad, my generation, some of them have never really suffered anything." And I go, that's her assessment of it. Not, of course, they've got broken hearts and relationships and identity things, but not been through a war and not had even a credit crunch pass them by because they were too young. It's like, just that sort of psychological disturbance she's noticed with their friends. Like they've, been looked after, been in nice houses, had good lives, in a way that was unimaginable for most people in history. So I think even if churches teach about suffering, it never actually hits the rubber never hits the road until something really bad happens in life. And you and I know, you're a therapist, I'm a pastor. Eventually something in life catches up with you and happens to you. And then that's usually when people realize they're not ready for it. It's like, well, I sort of knew it was going to happen, but I didn't expect it to happen.
Yeah, exactly. I think it breeds that sense of, you were talking about in culture, people are told we'll have more than our parents and our kids will have more than us and life will be better. But of course, the evidence is, in many ways, that is true. I know the stuff that I've had compared to the life that my parents lived, and looking at, I've got two boys, both in their 20s, the life that they're leading or had been up until, a couple of months ago, that, there has been that progress, there has been that stuff. But I do also wonder, I don't know what the answer is, but I know with Facebook, the internet, social media in general, we are more connected to more people around the world, and yet at the same time we are more insulated, more isolated, more detached from other people. We all know 2/3 of the world's population goes to bed hungry, but it doesn't have any kind of emotional tag to it, that's just another thing on my news feed. I read that, and then 5 seconds later I'm reading something else, and 5 seconds later I'm reading something else. So whether that's all part and parcel of it, how it goes. But like you say, even in churches where it is a good, well-rounded gospel is preached, there's no guarantee that the message gets through, and and people are ready for it when it happens.
Yeah, so important one. Yeah, and maybe at this time an opportunity for us to go through and think through a theology of suffering and have it become part of our faith, and see that it was normal in the Bible and normal for Christians in history, that Christianity flourished in the face of much worse things than we're going through now, and that the sign that God was involved in your life was not living a long life and having lots of money and retiring by the sea. So that brings me on to the topic of, if we talk about faith stages, because I think you know about those, don't you?
Fowler's stages of faith. Are we
Fowler's
talking?
stages of faith. Yeah, I studied them years ago, and as I remember it, people start off with this guy James Fowler looked at stages of faith, and he made it a bit linear, and then there's different versions of it. But there are processes that you go through, and you have to go through a process of maturation as you get older, that it's normal to have a faith that is given to you. Then you have to it all has to sort of fall apart, and you realize I only believe what I believe because it was given to me by my parents or where I live. And then you discover your own faith, and that actually pain and suffering are intrinsic to and vital to growing in your faith and having your own faith. That's what I remember of Fowler. What
I remember it slightly differently. Oh no. I would no, the version or what I think of when I think of Fowler's stages of faith is I can't remember how many there are. I think there's 6, but he talks about originally our faith is very simplistic. It's good and bad, black and white. It's the kind of faith that a child has. All the stories in the Bible are 100% literally true. Goodies and baddies. The goodies wear white hats, the baddies wear black hats, and the goodies always win. Then as we begin to mature, we begin to integrate those sort of very simplistic stories into a more sort of, we think more in terms of like storytelling and meaning and that kind of stuff within the stories. And then we get to stage 3, I think it is. Someone who knows more than this will probably, someone's Googling it right now and finding out I know nothing.
I think it's 3 as well. We'll see if anyone notices.
Where faith becomes a list of rules and regulations. So to be a good Christian, don't drink, don't swear, don't smoke, don't sleep around, tick all the boxes, well done, you're a good boy. And so it becomes a list of rules, and it can become quite legalistic and religious, that kind of thing. Now, the problem is that many churches stop there, because the next stage is when you realise that actually there's life outside the boxes. I've been living in a box, and there is security in a box, remember. If people know the rules, they know what they need to do, they know what makes them in and what makes them out. We all have a deep sense of wanting to belong somewhere, to be part of something. So if the rules of the club are that I have to do certain things, I do those things, and then I'm a good member and people love me and accept me and I belong. So there is a real benefit in being in a box. And of course, from a pastor's point of view, I assume having a church full of people who know the rules and obey the rules is every pastor's dream, isn't it, really?
I couldn't possibly comment.
Yeah. But then the next stage is when you sort of kick down the walls of the box and realise that there's something much bigger than that, and then to step out into that and to mature into that. Although, of course, the people who are still in the box think you're backsliding because you're not obeying the rules anymore. So there's always that kind of tension. And it's similar to the way that people grow up, I think, just as human beings. When my boys were young, we taught them don't play with matches, don't run in the road, stop kicking your brother, all those kind of rules. And then as they grow up, they begin to question the rules and challenge the rules. And, why should I? Why should I go to bed now? Why should I wash my hands before meals? Why should I? And then during their teenage years, they're questioning and they've chucked off all the rules, and they're finding their own meaning and purpose and how do I live and what do I do? And the hope is obviously as adults, they come back to some semblance of faith or morality, or have something that we've tried to put into them as parents that they've held on to, but they have to own that for themselves. They have to own it for themselves. And part of that, like you say, is that process of maturation through all the other things. Which reminds me, we were talking on Monday, I know, about helicopter parents. I'm probably off on a tangent, but let me just talk this. So when my boys were younger, we lived near the beach, so we wanted them to enjoy the beach, enjoy the sea, but you have that fear, what if they drown, obviously. So the two choices are, you can either get them out of the water, or you can teach them how to swim. And if you decide I'm going to keep them out of the water, that just means for the rest of your life, you've got to make sure they just don't go near any body of water or they might drown. But in the process of teaching people how to swim, often, we've all done it, you go under a bit too long, you come up spluttering and gasping and all that kind of stuff, don't you? That's what happens. And it is that thing that if our kids get to 18, say, and then go off into the big wide world, but they've never experienced grief or loss or disappointment or confusion or sadness or just any kind of negative thing. And as parents, we want to protect our kids from that. Of course we do. Of course we do. But if we don't expose them to that in a safe environment where it can be handled and, you know, and can be dealt with in a healthy way, and we teach them how to deal with sadness, how to deal with disappointments, how to deal with frustration, those kind of things. If they don't learn those skills, then, you know, they reach 18 and they're not really equipped for life, I don't think. And I think that's the difficulty. And I think spiritually, it's that same thing. Are we, either by choice or by accident or by design or whatever, are we producing, you know, Christians who have been helicopter parented by pastors who want to protect their flock from all the bad things in the world, with a good heart, I'm sure, or is it better to you know, to have to face these things and deal with them, because eventually we're going to have to deal with them anyway, like you say. It's just whether or not we have that internal resilience, whether we've got the ability within ourselves to withstand all the things that life throws at us.
Yeah, because I've always thought with Fowler, when I encountered him years ago, that what we do is we Christians double down on this process and bundle in certitude and guarantees, and then what happens is life happens to you and you go, but I played by the rules, I behaved, I was told everything was going to be okay, and it's not. And then everything implodes, life implodes, faith implodes, and it's quite catastrophic. In fact, there's research, you know, the academic part of me that does research on church and culture and stuff. Evangelical Christians are prone to a double whammy, their kids, because helicopter parenting and snowplow parents, that's another phrase I heard the other week, you know, parents going in front of them and protecting them from everything. That's happening to all kids in the West a lot. And then Christians come along with a spirituality of, you know, don't worry, God will keep you happy, he'll sort everything out, nothing bad will happen to you. And that gets multiplied in even more. That's what's going on at the minute for another generation. And there's a thing called therapeutic moralistic deism. Have you come across that?
I'm going to say no, but as you talk about it, yeah, I might recognize.
You know what? Well, it's it'd be blindingly obvious to you. So basically, a bunch of researchers found out, surveying young adults a while ago, last 10 years or so, that what that leads to is a worldview, a way of seeing the world, where young people in particular, what faith gets reduced to therapy. God's there to make you feel better. Deism is God made the world and he's absent. He only intervenes in a crisis. So you don't really have to worry about him unless you need something. And the moralism, you've already touched on this, don't take drugs, you know, don't kill anyone, and don't have sex before marriage. And that's really what is formed and made worse especially for young people in our culture. And that's a pretty anemic version of faith in God.
It is, of course. Yeah, exactly. But again, in a consumer society, is that not more attractive if you want people to buy your product? That's the difficulty, isn't it? And interesting enough, you touch on something else. You know, that feeling that people have earned. They need to earn their thing. You know, I've been to church, I tithe, I read my Bible every day, I say my prayers. Therefore, God owes me. And when God says, "No, I don't," then what do we do with that? And it is, I mean, these are difficult things. We all have to wrestle with them. I'm not belittling how difficult these things are. It is a very difficult situation to be in. But I think there are, you know, it is an issue. And I think many pastors and church leaders, and, you know, you can read books and articles and stuff on the subject. It's been a question for a long time. You know, how do we do it? And I think it's that difference between, I've got a friend who's constantly talking about, there's a difference between numbers in church and discipleship. Jesus didn't say plant churches. He didn't say make Christians. He said make disciples. And that whole discipling process, what that is, how that works, the cost of discipleship, all that kind of stuff. You know, we all struggle with it. We were talking last night actually in our small group about the parable of the sower. You know, the 4 different seeds types of soil. What if that field that the sower was sowing in is me? Just I'm all 4 of those things, and the gospel falls on 4 different areas in my own heart. Some of it falls on where I'm very receptive to the gospel and I absolutely love it. But there's other parts of the gospel that fall on a very hard heart, like take up my cross and forgive my enemies. Why would I do that? Other parts of the gospel fall on part of my heart that's initially enthusiastic, but then gets choked off by cares and worries and all this kind of stuff. And we were looking at it and just having a time where we were just kind of sharing where we were at and how that works. So I think we're all in a process, aren't we? You know, progress, not perfection. We're all doing the best we can. We're all learning. But I do think it's at teachable moments like this with the pandemic where people can, you know, pause, reflect. How does my understanding of God inform this? How does this inform my understanding of God? And to do that kind of work of, you know, of questioning and discussion and debate. But again, you mentioned certitude, you know, that whole thing that in churches where we read the Bible like this and that's the answer, that's all there is to it, we're right and anyone who disagrees with us is wrong, then there is no room for questioning, there's no room for bend, there's no room for discussion, debate and doubting things and all those kind of things. And I think that's one of the things I like about Vineyard is it's got quite a broad theology, it's accepting of different people who believe different things, within reason obviously, but there isn't that kind of hard line what we teach, and if you don't like it, heave ho.
Yeah. Oh gosh, so many things to ask you. Let's talk about psychosis and neurosis.
My favourite subject. Yeah. As in a definition or as in...
Yeah, well, what's the difference? And I've heard you say that, you know, people that know the difference, people that have got neurosis might be well equipped at the moment. That made me laugh. I keep thinking about that when you said the other day. So
the difference between neurosis and psychosis in simple terms, in layman's terms, short. Yeah. That neurotics are mad, but they know they're mad. Psychotics are mad, but they don't know they're mad. So that's probably, as a therapist, I'm about to be struck off for saying it. The idea is, if you walk into a house late at night and it's dark, I turn the lights on because I'm afraid the bogeyman might get me. Now, I know there's no such thing as the bogeyman, there's no such thing as monsters under the bed. I just feel safer with the lights on. It's madness, but I know I'm mad. I do it anyway. We're all good. That's neurotic behaviour. Psychotic behaviour is when you believe there really is a bogeyman who'll get you. And if you don't turn the lights on, he will get you. And you genuinely believe it. So that's psychosis. Now, neurosis, which is what the vast majority of people that I see suffer from. So, for example, people who are suffer with health anxiety or even just extreme anxiety about anything and everything. I've had quite a few. I do a lot of supervision, so a lot of the clients I talk about are actually clients of other therapists, my supervisees, but I'll pretend they're my clients for the purpose of telling stories. A lot of people have said they've had clients who very neurotic, very anxious, very, it's the end of the world on a normal day. Suddenly the pandemic comes, and actually these are the people who are coping really well because they know how to deal with anxiety. They've lived with it all their life. Now their worst nightmare has come true. It's like, actually, I've been waiting for this day all my life.
See, I told you it was going to happen.
Absolutely, yes, I was born for such a time as this. It's that thing that they're handling it very, very well. But of course, part of it goes back to that thing, I think, about beliefs, what we were talking about before, and that shock factor of everything that we believed. If we believe life is going to be rosy, when it's not, we don't know how to handle that. If we believe life is awful and it's all going to end in misery, and then suddenly we get a pandemic, well, we were right, weren't we? And I think there's a comfort for people in knowing what's going on, understanding it. I think this is. I mean, we talked earlier, didn't we, about conspiracy theories? I know I'm going off on another tangent.
Oh yeah, conspiracy theories.
Yeah, but the point is,
is that neurotic behaviour or psychotic behaviour?
Well, don't get me started on. I think it depends, doesn't it? But it's that thing of people have a basic need to belong. They want to feel valued. The 3 basic needs of everyone is to feel safe, feel like they belong, and feel like they're valued. We need that as children to grow up healthily, and we need it as adults, although we look for it in different ways, but we need it. So it's a very strong driver to feel like we belong and that we're valued. Now, if there's some secret society that understands what's going on, and you're initiated into their secret knowledge, then there's a sense of belonging and a sense of, oh, I feel special, but it also brings an enormous comfort to know what's going on. You know, what everybody wants to know: how long's the pandemic going to last? How bad's it going to be? When is it going to be over? What are we going to do? Now, the answer to all those questions is, I don't know. But won't decide any politician who stands up and says, we haven't got a clue, we're just winging it. It's political suicide, isn't it? So we have to pretend that we know what's going on, and people find a comfort and a security in knowing what's going on, even though they've still got no control over it. So, and I think particularly in a postmodern world where, particularly in the younger generation, you know, who speaks with any kind of authority? Who do we trust? Who do we believe? You know, we're very sceptical of anyone and everyone, all that kind of stuff. So I think if you suddenly hit upon something that resonates with you, and you can belong to this club of people who also believe the same thing, then it brings with it a certain security and stability. And if you want to put that in a Christian context, I think if you go back 2,000 years to the Gnostics, who had secret knowledge, didn't they? This secret wisdom revealed by a demigod, that they knew things that mere mortals and normal Christians didn't know. But in our secret society, we know the answers. And if you're initiated into our secret society, you'll be one of us and you'll know the secrets. I think there's something very attractive about that. And I think there's a real pull to it and a real power in it as well. So I think that, you know, we want to understand because it gives us a sense of safety and security and comfort. Even if we can't do anything about it, at least we understand it. We want to belong. You know, we're always looking for, I think we're often, you know, looking for comfort, aren't we? We're looking for security.
Yeah, we are.
But when there is no security and stability, we start clutching at straws, don't we?
Yeah, human beings are human beings. They haven't changed.
Absolutely, yeah.
So yeah, so all these heresies that go around that. So Gnosticism, secret knowledge, to make, you know, that they're all ways of coping with life. Pelagianism's the one we talked about earlier. You know, actually, I'm supposed to trust Jesus, but really, I believe if I work hard enough, I deserve something. It just is human. That's the problem with heresies. They're misrepresentations of faith to pander to the bad ways we deal with God and with life.
But they're close enough to the truth, aren't they? It's like stereotypes. They're not the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. But there's enough truth in them that people think, oh yeah, that must be right. So you've kind of gone off and started off in a right direction, and then just veered off a little bit, haven't you? So I think, you know, with the conspiracy theories, if everyone said it was an alien invasion, you wouldn't get many people subscribing to that. But when you've got people saying, oh, it was an experiment in China, you know, they were, you know, messing out with bits and pieces, suddenly everyone's ears prick up a bit and they think, oh yeah, I can believe that. And suddenly you've got a conspiracy theory, haven't you?
And all these things come together, confirmation bias and all the other crazy things that go on in our brains. When you were talking about all that stuff there, it reminded me of, I heard about the other day about uncertainty, wondering whether this causes neuroses. And the experiment was, I think it was a bunch of behavioral psychologists who do weird things like electrocute people to see how they respond to stuff.
Yeah.
and they need therapy afterwards for it. Who wonders why? But they found that if people, the experiment was something along the lines of, if they knew they had something like a rock they had to turn over, and they knew that they were going to get an electric shock, and if they were told what level it would be, and then they had to measure how much pain they experienced, the people that turning over the rock who didn't know if they were going to get a shock and if they did, what level it would be, when some of them got a low level shock, they experienced more pain than the people who knew they were going to get a worse electric shock. In other words, they were saying uncertainty is just so difficult for us that in the face of it, we catastrophize, and that when something bad happens, we're experiencing it as worse than it really is.
Yeah.
Is that part of neurosis, or does it feed in? How does it feed into it all? Now I can talk to someone who knows what they're talking about.
Well, somebody pretends he knows what he's talking about.
Yeah.
Imposter syndrome. I can feel it creeping up on me. No, I think, yeah, I mean, it is neurotic behaviour again. Well, is it neurotic, or is it just it's unconscious behaviour? We just respond that way, don't we? But I think it is that it's that thing. Whenever things like experiments like this happen, I always think of the serenity prayer. Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, The courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And we talked earlier, didn't we, about acceptance and commitment therapy, which is a similar therapy built around, it's not built on that, but it's a similar sort of thing. That there are certain things that we can't change, so we need to work on how do I accept it. There are certain things I can change, so we need to work on where do I find the courage to change those things. And of course, the wisdom to know the difference. And it is that thing that there is a deep hunger, I think, in all of us to feel the security of knowing, of knowing we don't handle ambiguity very well. And again, coming back to churches, I've got a friend who talks about ministering the mystery of God, which I think is a brilliant expression. But he's quite happy to say, I don't know. He's quite happy, if you're talking about God and why does this happen and how does that work and what is it about God. There is, I think, particularly in conservative evangelical circles, or certainly the ones I grew up in, there's a need to be able to answer every single question. Here's the chapter, here's the verse, that proves it, it's done, we've answered every single question. Whereas I think, my own opinion, a more mature faith involves being able to say, I really don't know. And it is that sense of mystery of God, but it doesn't sit right with people. We don't like not knowing, we don't like ambiguity. Again, coming back to, we like rules, we like the regulations, we like to know this is what we do, this is how we do it. We feel safe in that. It brings safety. Let me tell you a story. I had a friend, she said that she was brought up for the first 2 or 3 years of her life. She was brought up, 18 months, 2 years, anyway, doesn't matter, in a flat, first floor of a house, and somebody else at the bottom floor. And so it was very restrictive, don't make too much noise, don't do this, don't do that. When she was 2 years old, her parents moved to a 3-bedroom house, big garden, everything. And for the first 6 weeks, she was unutterably miserable. Her mum told her, you just cried all the time. Actually, her mum had this brainwave, got her old crib out, set it up, put her in it. She was perfectly happy. Within that security of, this is my world and I know how it works and I'm safe in it, it's all perfectly fine. Those walls away, those boundaries away, and suddenly you've got this big wide world with all this unknown and all these things that, might be good, they might be bad, they might be, who knows. And the thing about human beings is that we are wired for survival. We're not wired for happiness. We're wired for survival. Instinctively, we're geared towards survival. And of course, not knowing something can be very, very dangerous. And you see that kind of imagery throughout the Bible with, darkness symbolizing evil, because in a world where you didn't have electric light bulbs and street lamps and everything, if it was dark and there were enemies in the dark, whether they were an army or it was wolves or it was whatever, the darkness becomes a very, very scary place because we don't know. We don't know what's in there. We don't know what's going on. And so I think it's a fundamental sort of built into our genetic DNA kind of right at the very base level that not knowing something is potentially dangerous and threatening. And therefore we find it very difficult to sit with it and just accept it and embrace it and just accept it's ambiguous, nobody knows, and we just have to accept it. We just have to accept that we don't know.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in a very abusive, lots of domestic violence and abuse, emotional, physical, sexual when I was a kid. And unsurprisingly ended up, having I call it a breakdown when I was 30. I know technically they're not breakdowns, but just didn't realize the level of anxiety I carried through my life. But it was a survival mechanism. I mean, that's what I learned with CBT. It was like, to survive getting beaten, I had to constantly be on the lookout for the signs of when my mother would, lay out the next beating. And it was a survival thing. But then it gets bad as you get older, because then you see catastrophe where there isn't catastrophe and get triggered. So as a pastor, it's actually, I call it my spider sense. I can still actually know, I can have a look with someone's face and I know I can instantly read them and know something's happening because I've got that ability from when I was a kid. And that can be good as a pastor because something's wrong, but it means I often still overread situations. And that's where CBT has really helped me. If we come back to therapy, and you talked about ACT therapy, and there's lots of therapies that are good, but even though we're hardwired for this survival, fight, flight, not dealing with uncertainty, there are practices and things we can do that bring out different responses and behaviors in us, aren't there? I mean, that's why you do therapy, isn't it? You help people,
Yeah.
because otherwise, what's the point if this is the way we are?
Yeah. It's all smoke and mirrors anyway. Yeah, you're quite right.
Yeah. So tell us a bit more about, why would something like CBT therapy be helpful at a time like this? With, you're sitting there thinking, am I going to lose my job tomorrow? Is the world going to come to an end? Is there going to be a war? What would CBT do for us?
Well, I feel ethically obliged to say there are many different types of therapy, and they're all very good. And I do use CBT, and also another one called transactional analysis, which mainly works around inner child work, which people would have heard. So we can talk about that later if you want as well. So the fundamentals of CBT are, in its simplest form, that what our core beliefs, the things that we fundamentally believe about ourselves, about the world, about other people, that then shape how we think, how we feel, and how we behave. Like in the example that you had there, there's a fundamental belief of I'm about to take a beating, and therefore it affects how you think. I'm constantly on the alert. I need to read it. I need to make sure, all these kind of things. So it all comes down to, or part of the process of CBT therapy is working out what those core beliefs are, and then working on how do we change them. That's the most important. So in a spiritual sense, in a Christian sense, it does come down to what do we believe, not just, I believe in God the Father, maker of heaven and earth, but what do we believe about the nature of God? For example, do we believe that God is for me? Do we believe in grace and mercy? Do we believe that I need to earn God's forgiveness? Do we believe that God will save me from every bad thing that's ever happened? When it comes down to the real nitty gritty, what do I actually believe? What does my faith actually tell me? Because in that, it will then shape how I think, how I feel, how I behave. So if, for example, your belief is, like with these very anxious clients, your belief is it's all bad, it's all going to end in misery, it's all everything, then suddenly, when you're in a situation like this, there is a sense of familiarity. I know how this works. I know how to keep myself safe and keep myself protected, because my belief is that this is how it is. If my belief as a Christian is God is going to heal me from everything, He's going to protect me and everyone I love from everything, then it's going to affect the way I look at it, and the way I think, and the way I feel, and the way I respond, and all those kind of things. So it is, in therapy, what we would do would be exploring, okay, what do you believe? And, those core beliefs, but often unconscious. Often, if you said to Christians, do you believe in grace and mercy? Do you believe we're saved by faith? We're saved by the grace of Jesus? All Christians would say yes. What we're talking about is in real life, how quickly it is and how easily it is to fall into legalism, all that kind of stuff. I remember somebody said that the way to tell whether you're legalistic or not is if you start doing something, like back in the church I was in, we used to have a quiet time every morning. I don't know whether people do this anymore. You had little Bible reading notes every day with Jesus, all those kind of things. And so you say, well, I'm going to do this every morning. And then suddenly one morning you don't do it. Maybe you were tired, maybe you forgot, maybe you were busy, maybe you overslept, who knows. But for one day you don't do it. What's your reaction to that? Because if your reaction is guilt, then you are locked into that legalistic thing of, I must do this thing or else. If you're locked into grace and mercy, doesn't matter, just forgot to do it, don't worry, I'll do it later, I'll do it tomorrow. But how quickly we can get into those kind of beliefs. And again, if people's belief is, I say my prayers, I tithe, I come to church every Sunday, therefore, it's the difference. If you have a child who is obedient because his parents love him, grow up very differently than a child who is obedient so that his parents will love him. And they're two very, very different mental attitudes. But of course, both of them produce obedient children. So it's difficult from the outside looking in to know, in church, I've got all these Christians who are, behaving themselves and doing good things and being lovely people. Are they doing that because Jesus loves them? Or are they doing it so that Jesus loves them? And from the outside looking in, that's very, very difficult to tell. And the truth is, I think often we're a kind of mix and match of both, aren't we, really, in many situations? But that's the difference. That's that sort of core belief in the real world. Am I sold out for Jesus because He loves me, or am I sold out for Jesus so that he loves me? But they produce two very different types of people, unfortunately.
Yeah, they are. I mean, my own therapy journey, and then embraced it, and it helped me and realized how it could integrate with my faith and brought understanding for false beliefs and things that I'd really been, been living out of. And I recommend it a lot to people in church. Life happens to them. They go, why am I behaving like this, feeling like this? Because I thought I believed this, but I'm behaving like this. And and I know enough to say, well, we've all got coping mechanisms. There were things in the past that you learn how to behave, to respond to things, and try to encourage them and say, this is good. I mean, it's back to Fowler, isn't it? It's like I go, no, you're on the threshold of growth and development. And this is, because that's a theology of suffering. You're in good company. This is what scripture says. When life happens and you wrestle with your faith is the most precious time. And God's let you go through something so that you can let go of that thing and find what he really has for you in life. And I'm anticipating I'm going to be having, after lockdown, a lot more of those conversations with people, because so many of us are going, I thought I was this, but I've realized all of this stuff came up to cope with this, and I don't want it. And the good news is you don't have to stay like that for the rest of your life. You've got agency. I know you and I talked about that the other day. You've got agency. We can make choices about who we are and what we do and how we respond, can't we? So let me ask you the question here, and then I'm going to dive into to finish some specific questions, if we can, Peter. Tell us the difference between, because I just mentioned agency, only because you mentioned it the other day, being fatalistic versus agency. You talked to me about that and why that was important.
There's a difference between resignation and acceptance. I think that's how we kind of got onto it, isn't it? It's that thing that, well, a classic example obviously is the pandemic. We can't do anything about it. We're in shutdown. We're in our homes. It is going to be what it is for, however long it lasts. So we've got two responses to it. We can either accept it, which is that kind of healthy acceptance of it is what it is. I might not like it, but it is what it is. I know there's nothing I can do about it. I'll find good where I can. I'll, take opportunities if I get them, but I'm going to accept that this is the way it is right now, and that's okay. Against that resignation of, oh God, well, we're locked in again. Oh, I suppose I've just got to sit with it. I've got to lump it. I've got to more, And again, from the outside, they might both look exactly the same, but internally, one is that genuine acceptance of it is what it is, and I'm okay with that. And the other one is that being resigned, fatalistic. Oh, what's the point? It's all gone wrong. There's no point to anything, and it leads off into those kind of very depressive and very self-destructive thought patterns, that kind of stuff. And that's the thing. To come back to something else that you were saying earlier, or just that last section there, is about that thing. It's about deconstruction and reconstruction, isn't it? A lot of therapy again, and again, I think theologically this is true with Christians as well. We go through a process of deconstructing a lot of and I think a lot of people are in this process now. They're deconstructing, tearing down the things that they realise they just don't work. But at the same time, we can reconstruct something new and something better. And partly with the pandemic, there's a difference between people who choose to embrace change and people who have change thrust upon them. So some people are looking at this thinking, I'm living a slower pace of life. I'm spending more time with my family, or assuming that's a good thing, of course. And so there's, some people are thinking, well, I can change, I can grow, I can do these things. That's good. Other people are being forced to spend more time with their family, forced to have a slower life, forced to do exactly the same things, but not liking it. And when we were talking Monday, I was saying about living simply. That's something that, I embraced several years ago, trying to just live a little bit more simply, be more simple, be time rich and money poor, all these kind of things, just to try and live that kind of life. So now that we're in lockdown, I think it's not affected me as badly as it has some people, because I was living more simply anyway. Now, for me, I embraced that change. I chose it. I pursued it. I, looked at it, read up on it, talked to people about it, prayed about it, lived it, eased myself into it. So that was a choice that I made. That was my agency. I decided this is who I want to be, how I want to live. This is what my life is going to be. So I have pursued that. Whereas other people now have been forced to live more simply. They've been forced to be time rich and money poor. They've been forced to, evaluate their values and their principles or their, all these things. And there is a difference between people who, if you choose to do something or if you're forced to do something, they are two very different ways of going about it. Yeah. Now, we talked about teachable moments earlier. This friend of mine who often talks about teachable moments. This is a teachable moment, but of course people don't have to learn. Any teacher will tell you, if you've got a class full of 30 students, you can teach, but that doesn't necessarily mean anyone's going to learn. And I think that's the point. Although I would have a little caveat to that, which is the most important thing for lockdown, to my mind, is people come through it as healthy as they can do, mentally and emotionally, physically, come through it as healthy as possible. What they don't need is somebody else saying, well, you should be using this time to read your Bible every day and pray every day, and you should be doing this and you should be doing that, and just putting more pressure on people. Where for some people, actually just getting through the day with some semblance of sanity is maybe a little bit more than they can sustain right now. So it's entirely up to what people do. I'm not, trying to put pressure on people. I just think there's an opportunity for people, if they're in a good and healthy place to do it, to reinvent themselves. So I was talking to some people about, the new normal. We're all talking about that, aren't we? When it's all over, what do you think the new normal will be? And there was that sense, again, talking about fatalism, that some people had that very fatalistic, well, it'll just be whatever we're told it is. It'll be whatever the government decides it is. It'll be whatever, I don't know, these mysterious forces out there that control us will decide the new normal is. But other people are looking at it thinking, with a sense of agency, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to work less. I'm going to spend more time with my family. I'm going to do this, and sort of owning it, dealing with it, being proactive rather than reactive, and just saying, yeah, this is, I've decided that I want my life to look more like this. I've got a friend who's been commuting up and down to London, and now that she's not doing that, is realising just how many hours a day she spent on a train, how physically tired she was at the end of the day. And whereas, yes, we all need to work, and so there's some people have more freedom in that area than other people do. So, I'm not laying it universally over everybody. Just for her, she's decided once this is all over, she's either going to work from home a lot more, or she's going to change to a more local job, because recognising that work-life balance was out of whack. So for her, that's more agency-driven, post-pandemic life. But other people haven't seemed to make that connection, that actually we can choose what kind of life within reason. I appreciate, there's arguments, pros and cons to how much change people can make. But we've all got a certain amount of agency, and it's whether or not we embrace it and use it and try to be proactive in life.
Yeah, I've been talking to a few friends who, we live right on the outskirts of London, and lots of people that work in it, and I'm hearing that from all. I'm going, everyone knows they're busy, they're in the rat race and they chase around things, and if they've got kids, they put them in 500 clubs, and then there's all these lifestyles that go with it. And I'm hearing that a lot from people going, it's not that we don't teach about that in church and talk about it, but when this has happened, people are suddenly going, why do we do that? It's really hit them now that the button's been hit to take them out of it, and there is this opportunity. So I'm hearing you, Peter, getting towards the end now. So I've heard you say through this, we talked about some big areas here, but landing it on what we can do and how this affects us and how we come through it well. One of them was, don't minimize. You've got to express how you feel. There's no point saying this isn't World War II. I need to pull myself together. If you've got some loss, talk about it. We talked about that. But I've just heard you touch on another one. I would call it, would it be survivor's guilt? There's some people going, I'm going through this. I've got a guaranteed job. This isn't going to affect me. I've got nice time with my family. They're probably embarrassed to talk to other people about it. Is that a real thing?
Yeah, absolutely, survivor guilt. Yeah, very much so. And I think there will be, to be honest, I was struggling with this to a certain extent in the beginning. More, I've kind of settled into it now. But for example, as I've said before, both my parents are already dead. I've got 2 kids, both of whom fit and healthy. They work online, so they're okay. Financially, I'm okay, that I can roll with what there is at the minute. So there's nobody who's keeping me up at night with me worrying about they're very vulnerable or they're, what if, all that kind of stuff. I've got a little back garden I can sit in the sun. I've got the internet, so I can Zoom people and talk to people. So at the moment, and as an introvert, to be perfectly honest with you, not having to deal with very irritating people all day, it's a bit of a blessing. So, but it was that feeling that I knew when I was talking to people, like at church, small group, we would, doing Zoom, all this kind of stuff, that some people are genuinely struggling. I've got a friend who's a single parent whose daughter is on the autistic spectrum. She's hyperactive. That's no fun. I've got people who have got, elderly relatives that they're genuinely concerned about. They're people who are in high risk groups, because they're asthmatic or whatever, that, these are very real dangers, very real fears, very real, friends in the NHS who are going in every day and just seeing how bad it really is. And I'm living in my happy little bubble where I get to watch TV and read a book, and talking to them, suddenly getting that sense of shame really more than anything else of actually lockdown's not that bad for me, to be perfectly honest. And it is that thing of being able to balance sensitivity to other people who are genuinely struggling, at the same time being able to balance that with trying to keep myself healthy, keep myself as well as I can, and recognizing that in the real world, I am doing okay, and that's perfectly acceptable too. So it is a dangerous, it's kind of, well, it's more of not dangerous, it's a tightrope, isn't it, of falling one way or the other. But that is a very difficult thing. And we want to be sensitive to the people who are struggling. We want to be sensitive to the people who aren't struggling. And as with everything, it's that broad spectrum of life. But in many ways, I think it's just become more extreme, because the truth is that in all areas of life, on any day, in any, a year ago, there were people who were struggling and there were people who were happy. And in the church community at any given time, you've got some people who are having the best time of their life sitting right next to people who are having the worst time of their life. And we need to be sensitive to both and allow both to validate their experience without but survivor guilt, it's a common thing, and I think there'll be a lot of it. People will come out of the pandemic and they won't have lost anyone or suffered anything, and like you say, their jobs are secure. They'll just get back in the car, go off to work, and life will return to normal very, very quickly. Whereas other people, it will take them a long time to process grief, for example, or they'll suddenly be unemployed, or there's going to be a broad spectrum of responses once it's all over. Yeah, very definitely.
Tell me about, because I know you mentioned it and it sounded good at the time, but I've forgotten what it was. The hole in the donut.
Oh yeah, the hole in the donut. I can't remember.
I'll try and remember it this time. Yeah. I was trying to tell my wife, but I couldn't remember it. I said, it's really good. I'm going to ask him again on Friday.
Yeah. We were talking about, well, it's a thing that I came across. It's a thing that they use in the 12-step program, AA in particular, that they talk about the hole in the donut. The thing is that we define ourselves by the things that we do. So we were talking about the kind of identity crises that people can have, like in the pandemic, for example. If I'm a workaholic, if I go out, if I do stuff, if I'm a doer, if I'm serving on rotas, if I'm, feeding the poor, healing the sick, doing stuff, and then suddenly I can't do that stuff, those people are going to struggle with the pandemic more than people who are more introvert and reflective and contemplative, because we can carry on doing those things even in lockdown. And so, particularly say with an alcoholic, for example, he decides he doesn't want to be an alcoholic anymore. He decides he wants to give up his drinking and all the stuff that goes with that. But the difficulties, or the problem that a lot of people have in that situation is, if I give up being this kind of person, if I want to change and become someone else, if I give up all these things that make me me, what if I'm like a donut and I find out that when I've given up all that stuff, all that's left is the hole in the donut? And actually all those things that used to define me, if I'm not those things anymore, then who am I? And what am I for? And what do I do with life? So a lot of that, that conversation we were having, that was coming out of identity and, how we define ourselves and the things that people do and how they are. But yeah, the hole in the donut is that fear that if I give up being this person, all that stuff, if I give all that stuff up, what if all that's left is the hole in the donut? Yeah.
Yeah. So like for me then, does this make sense? I was, I'm a recovering workaholic. That was my drug of choice. My siblings and family got extended drug and alcohol abuse. And CBT helped me realize that my gauge for measuring my work. So I still tell myself that when I'm feeling a little bit lazy, I'm probably getting it just right. I can't measure, what not working hard is. But then there's a part of me that embraces it and goes, actually, I've had to embrace the other side of that, because I did fear at one point, through therapy, if I lose that, what will I be without someone who's known for working really hard? But the flip side of it is actually I can thrive in a certain way by working. I can outwork a lot of people, and that's not workaholism. That's just my bent, and that's okay. And it's finding that balance. And yeah, so I'm finding it again. And I guess a lot of people are going to be, aren't they, in this crisis? I'm like, what's me using an ability that I have, and where does it go back into workaholism for control? And I find myself at the minute reaching for my old therapy notes and diagrams, and I start to feel, I'm feeling a bit lazy.
Well, I mean, you hit it on the head. It's about balance, isn't it? I mean, like, to use the example of drinking, some people, they can have a drink, they stop, they go home again, no problem with that. And anything like that, you could say, like, there's nothing wrong in a crisis, in a recession, where everything dips off and goes bad. The one thing where sales boom is chocolate, apparently, because we all a little bit of a treat. I'm struggling and it's hard, so I deserve a treat. I'm going to have a bar of chocolate, so sales go up. Now, there's nothing wrong with a bit of chocolate now and again. Nothing wrong with it at all. But overeating is an issue. And it's like with everything, there's nothing wrong with a little bit of this or a little bit of that. Maybe not everything, a little bit of adultery here and there. But most things, a little bit isn't too bad. The real question is, do I control that thing, or does that thing control me? That's really the question. And only you can answer that yourself. Your levels of, no, this is healthy for me, for someone else would be, that's just mad.
You got me worried now, because I don't have a sweet tooth and I never eat chocolate, but I've started eating lots of chocolate.
There you go, you see.
Oh no, what's wrong with me? I'm like, my wife has said, why do you eat chocolate? You never eat chocolate. I go, I don't know. I've got a craving for, I've got some. So you got me paranoid now. So let me, got a few little things, because just want to make the most of this time. And the great thing in the video, everything will be linked out so people can jump to the topic and interest in it. So compassion fatigue.
Yes.
What's that, and how will that be happening at the minute?
Yeah, well, compassion fatigue is where people give out, and they love and love and love, and then they get to the point where they just think, I just don't want to do it anymore. And then I think it's like breathing. We need to breathe in so that we can breathe out. We need to breathe out so that we can breathe in. And compassion is the same. We can give out in compassion as long as we're receiving in with compassion. And different people are loved in different ways and receive love in different ways. I don't know whether you've ever read The 5 Love Languages by so you know that there are different ways people give and receive love. Now, if I receive love by physical contact, I like to be hugged, I like, I'm tactile, all this kind of thing. To be in lockdown on my own, I will be starved of love. And so if I'm not feeling the love coming in, it's going to be harder for me to give the love going out. So that's another thing. So it is a thing, but I remember, I think it was Billy Connolly, if I could even say the word, who was saying that compassion fatigue, really compassion is just love. How can you have love fatigue? How can we as human beings just stop loving people? But I think, at the same time, again, it's to do with being healthy. We need to have it come in, we need to have it come out. If you're just giving out all the time, you're just going to burn out. And similarly, if you just sit there sucking it all up all the time, that's not going to be good for you either. So a lot of this comes down to self-care. That's fundamental in all aspects of therapy, is how do we look after ourselves, which again is different for different people. But to give ourselves time, give ourselves permission. I'm allowed to look after myself. I'm allowed to take some time out. I'm allowed to do something that's good for me. That kind of stuff, that's important. And we talked on Monday about resilience in general, didn't we?
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. You mentioned a TED talk on resilience, and then you quickly walk through what resilience is, because a lot of people, it's been popular even before now. It's like people talk about, it's just resilience, isn't it? And there's another book about grit, all that kind of stuff. But you were saying, you gave a nice little outline for me of 1, 2, 3, a few things that it was. So tell us again, what is resilience?
Yeah, so the TED talk is by a lady who's, I think she was a research scientist into resilience, and then her daughter was killed by a drunk driver. So she kind of had to put all that stuff into practice. But it's a TED talk. which is called something like 3 Characteristics of Resilient People, if you want to Google it. It's interestingly, she starts off with the audience saying, could you just put your hands up if you've ever suffered a loss, you've ever lost anyone you love, you've lost a job, if you've ever been divorced, if you've ever had your heart broken, if you've ever had an abortion, if you've ever been bullied, if you've ever been abused, if you've ever been... And by the end of her list, of course, everyone's got their hands up. We've all suffered something. Going back to our theology of suffering, we all suffer, so why don't we have a theology of suffering? But yeah, she says basically there are 3 things, if you want it to help people be resilient, to get people through stuff, they need to have 3 qualities. One is acceptance. So just the ability to accept it is what it is, there's nothing I can do about it. In her case, she was going through a lot of things like, why me, why my daughter, it's not fair, when of course she came to realise, why not my daughter? Why does it have to be anybody's daughter? But it's life, it happens, and the ability just to accept, again coming back to acceptance and commitment we were talking about. So acceptance is the first thing. The second thing is gratitude, to be grateful for what we have rather than to become resentful over the things that we don't have. And again, I think in lockdown, where a lot of people have lost a lot of things, not just maybe I've lost a job, but you know, friends and social life and rhythm and routine and just all those things, that just our daily interactions which reaffirm who I am and I'm loved and I'm part of something and I belong, those kind of things, that we've lost a lot. But if we focus on and are grateful for the things that we still have, that's the second characteristic. And the third one is the ability to ask myself, is what I'm doing helping me or harming me? And if it's harming me, just stop doing it, which is often easier said than done, of course. And I think in her case, she was talking about she used to get up every morning and just look at photos of her daughter. And then one day she realised, actually, you know what, this isn't helping me at all. So she just put them in a box, put them away, and maybe gets them out once a year on a birthday or something, you know, but doesn't look at them all the time. So if we can accept, with the pandemic expressly, but of course this applies to all areas of life, if we can accept it is what it is, nothing we can do about it, it's okay, we just, you know, do what you can. If we are grateful for the things that we have got. So for example, our Sunday services, and Dave and Laura will tell you this is true themselves, some of the Sunday services, car crash springs to mind. That's not my expression, but I'm just saying. However, my brother keeps sending me links to these, you know, tip-top services by tip-top churches, and just the production values. I'm sure they're absolutely brilliant. But the point is, I want to be with my community. I want to be with my friends. I want to be with the people I love. So I'm Sunday mornings on Zoom, obviously, but I'm still at church because those are the people I love. That's the community I love, and that's where I want to be. And that's how it is. So yeah, so it's how, I can't remember how I got onto that story now, but it is that thing, you know, acceptance, gratitude, and the ability to say, no, if this isn't doing me any good, let's just stop doing it. Let's just stop doing it.
Would that be things like switch the news off, stop scrolling through social media?
Yeah. Well, I know for myself, the first week or so, I could feel the anxiety, and I realised that actually what's feeding that is constantly being on social media, and particularly in the beginning. I don't know whether it's true now because I've not really been on it, but there were loads of things telling you what it was, how to do it, what the real information was, you need to do this, and there were loads of trolls who were putting out bits and pieces that were totally untrue, but just for the fun of it or whatever. So I just stopped looking at social media. I stopped watching the news, because I think if you're tuning in every hour on the hour to find out how many more people have died, I can't see that's doing you any good. I was on YouTube. I used to looking at the like little snippet stand-up comics, people like that. But more and more the recommended videos were, look how many people are dead. Look what's happening to all these dead people. Look how bad it is. And I was just like, I don't even want to know. I know it's out there, but I don't want to have to be looking at it all the time. So I've come right down on how often I'll get on there. But it is that recognising that for me, that was feeding my anxiety. It wasn't doing me any favours at all. It wasn't changing anything, because just as I knew about it, didn't make it go away any quicker. So yeah, it's just having that ability to recognise in yourself. And that might be even the simple things as the thoughts that are going on inside my head. You know, if I'm sitting just thinking, oh, it's awful, isn't it? It's awful, it's awful. Then sooner or later, you're going to end up pretty low. So it's about, even at a very basic level, can I learn to control what I think about and the things that I do,
Yeah. I did the same, you know, decided I'll just grab my news at the end of the day, get in, get out, you know, not going to be in denial, but can't can't fall down that rabbit hole of the
Yeah.
clickbait and dramatic headlines to lure you in. Right, a couple more things if you could do it, because I've got you here. I want to make the most of it. This is brilliant. I want to ask you.
I'm not going anywhere, Jason. So
Brilliant.
It's any time over the next 10 weeks, I'll still be here.
Well, yeah, there might be some follow-ups to this. People ask questions. So I want to ask you about perfectionism.
Yes.
And because you mentioned to me that how that could be particularly difficult in this current environment.
Well, I think, again, we were talking specifically in terms of stress, weren't we? I think people who feel stress, there's normally the 4 characteristics of people who suffer from stress. Okay, so to give you a very brief overview of stress. Number 1, there's no such thing as stress. Stress is a response to pressure. So if you think of like brain surgeons, I would have thought that's a very stressful job. If it was a stressful job, every brain surgeon in the world would be off on the sick all day, every day. It's a high pressure job, but it's not a high stress job, because stress is a response. So anything can be stressful if you respond to pressure poorly. So the people who respond to pressure poorly, on the whole, fall into 4 categories. Actually, normally they fall into all 4 of those categories, but the 4 categories are, number 1 is perfectionism. So either they have to do it and they have to do it perfectly, and that's a very high pressure attitude to have. But the flip side to that is that it comes out as apathy. I'm not going to be perfect. What's the point of trying? I'm just going to sit and do nothing. I can't be bothered to even try it because I know it won't be good enough. So they can look complete opposites, but the root is still perfectionism. The second one is people pleasing and overly concerned about what other people think about us, other people's opinion of us. And often the biggest fear about what other people think about us is our fear that they might actually say out loud what the little voices in our head are saying about us all day, every day anyway. So whether it's true or not doesn't matter. The point is we're still afraid of what other people might think of us. The third one is people who have control issues. So either they feel like they have to be in control of everything all day, every day, which again, that's stressful, or people who feel like they're not in control at all, which is equally stressful. And particularly for people who've had abusive upbringings, for example, the last time I wasn't in control, that all went very badly. So that's the root of control issues. And the 4th thing is people who ignore the early warning system. So every time someone comes in, they've been signed off from work because of stress, they sit down and I say, okay, tell me the story. It always starts 6 months ago, ... So the point is, if you'd come 6 months ago, we could have dealt with this and you'd have been okay. But it started and it went a little bit more, and got progressively worse until you reached breaking point, essentially, and now you're in this hole. So they're the 4 things that I always end up talking about with people whenever they're talking about stress. And so people who find lockdown stressful, just to do that kind of reflective work of, okay, am I a perfectionist, and what's the expectations I'm putting on myself, how I should be in lockdown, which again I think probably affects pastors. I'm guessing affects pastors. The idea is that you've got your flock looking to you for guidance. Help us through a pandemic. You know everything, when of course you're struggling with your own demons, aren't you? You've never been in a pandemic. You don't know what to do. You don't know how to use Zoom or any of this. I mean, the learning curve of technology for most people has been fantastic, hasn't it, over the last few weeks? So, what are the expectations you're putting on yourself? Are you worried about what other people think about what you should or shouldn't be doing? The fact that you haven't washed your hair or had to shave or change your clothes in the last 6 weeks because you've got a house full of kids and it's all you can do not to kill somebody. I bet the neighbours are complaining about me, and the control issues, that I should be in control. I need to feel like I'm in control, and actually there's very little right now we can control. And again, that comes back to the serenity prayer, serenity to accept the things you can't change, courage to change the things you can. But also the early warning system. If you're struggling, there are, again, not promoting myself, but just therapy in general, there are therapists who are still working either by phone or online. Some are doing face-to-face work. We are part of the government's list of people who aren't allowed to continue working, mental health issues. There are lots of organisations out there who are more than happy to see people. There are organisations out there who see people at reduced rates. I know there are ones in Southend that see people at reduced rates for people who can't help it. And even just on a very sort of fundamental level of just talking to somebody, people often self-edit, or I can't find people, they're tired of me moaning, they're tired of me struggling, they're all of this. And the truth is, maybe some people are tired of it, I don't know. But if you can talk to somebody and just say, look, I'm just having a bad day, I'm really struggling. And then people who listen to that, often the urge then is to fix people. Just recognise you can't fix them. And often just the process of talking is like venting a system. You get it out. Once it's out, I'm done, I'm happy, I've released some of the pressure. I might need to talk again in a couple of days, but for now, you know what? It's all good. I feel better for it. Thanks.
Last question, and then I'll ask you a bit more about that, which is resources and stuff. And I know you've got some great materials. We talked about self-awareness the other day. Why some people are immune to self-reflection. This whole pandemic is just going to pass. Like I said, I'm a pastor. I've been pastor long enough. People are going to be rough. It would just pass them by. Why would I have reflected on anything or thought about anything? Even if something bad happened to them, they still won't. How does that happen?
Well, I can answer that question. I don't know. Why does it happen? I mean, I'll tell you a story. This is the story I told you on Monday. I had a lady who was a client, very, well paid, great job, very successful at what she did. She was obviously like top range, whatever. She worked in the city. She was absolutely fantastic. There were issues at home about raising the children. Her husband came from a culture where the parents would raise the children or would have a big say in how the children was raised. She was British and had that issue of they're my kids, butt out, all that kind of stuff. Of course, her husband caught in the middle between his mother and his wife and his kids and all this kind of stuff. And so I answered the question, how do you think your husband feels about being caught in the middle? And there was this absolute blank. She had never even thought to view it from somebody else's point of view. It had never dawned on her what it might be like for her husband to even ask herself the question, let alone be able to work out how he felt. The question never dawned on her. I really don't know where that comes from. I sometimes envy people. Ignorance is bliss after all. Where it comes from, I really don't know. But I like to think that Christianity is a reflective practice at a certain level. And I'd like to think that that's one of the ways in which we are, or could be, maybe should be, better equipped to deal with what's going on. That process of being able to, to reflect on life. And I can't remember who it was. I think it might have been Spurgeon who said that we have the Bible in one hand and a newspaper in the other, don't we? That it's that thing of what does my understanding of God teach me about this? What does this teach me in my understanding of God? That kind of reflective practice. But I think a large part of therapy is encouraging people, or sometimes even teaching people, to be reflective. Why do I do what I do? What's behind that? Because if you can get to the root of it, and a lot of it is unconscious behaviour, if you can get to the root of it, then obviously then if I understand what I'm doing and I understand why I'm doing it, then okay, maybe I can stop doing it or do something better.
Yeah. And within that, you talked about something called a metanoia, the light bulb moment.
The light bulb moment, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, lots of people know metanoia for repentance. There's a Greek word in the Bible, but in therapeutic terms, why is that important in self-reflection?
There's a place in London, I think, called the Metanoia Institute, which is a training place for therapists, and it's called Metanoia because metanoia, as I understand it from a therapeutic point of view, is that light bulb moment, that moment where you're doing the work. Okay, why are you like this? And you suddenly you see patterns in your behaviour, or you realise, oh, it's all my parents' fault, or whatever that light bulb moment is. But that moment of, oh, now I get it. That's the metanoia moment, and that's what therapy is about fundamentally. Is because when people leave therapy, often externally they're in exactly the same position they were when they went into therapy, but internally everything's different. Their whole worldview has changed, their paradigm has shifted, their self-awareness is different, the way they view things is different. And good therapy, right down deep therapy, as you will know, it changes people forever. They're never the same again. And but that moment of shift, that moment of I used to see it this way, but now I see it this way. That moment in the Matrix, I think, red pill, blue pill. Once you've taken it, you can't untake it. That once you've taken it and you've seen it for what it is, That's the metanoia moment. That's the aha, the light bulb moment. That's the metanoia moment. And of course, metanoia is, yeah, it is the Greek word. New Testament was written in Greek, and it is translated as repentance. The church I grew up in, of course, repentance meant stop sinning, Peter, and which is part of metanoia, obviously. But what Jesus is really talking about is much bigger and broader than that. It's change your worldview, see it differently, have that moment of, oh, now I get it. And yeah, but that's so metanoia is a concept in therapy and in church, which is, I think of them as being two sides of the same coin, but just maybe in slightly different ways. Yeah.
Brilliant, brilliant. Oh, so good. So let's finish with resources. You've got, I mean, and we'll make these all available in the notes and the descriptions for the video and where we send this out. So firstly, you've got a website, Peter Wyatt, WYATT, peterwyatt.co.uk. And you've got links from there to a bunch of YouTube videos, haven't you, as well? I think
there's two pages on there in particular. One is, there is a page called Resources, which has a lot of the national organisations like AA, like Mind, like the Samaritans. So if there's anything specific or in particular that you're struggling with, there should be a link on there to find, all the different, the more specific, sort of like a signposting service. But there is also a page on there of YouTube videos. I made a series of videos, this is a long time ago now. They're just short, they're like 2-3 minute videos. Basically, 3 sections. One is why am I like this? One is how do I get better? And one is what can I do in the meantime? And they're just short videos on anxiety, depression, OCD, stress, some of the stuff that we've talked about here. Some of them outline the basic models like the cognitive behavioural model, the ABC model as it's called, that you might have come across from other people. You can Google that. So the inner child stuff, there's some of that. There's stuff about the process of change and how I change and what I need to do to change. There's stuff about coping mechanisms. Okay, how do I cope in the meantime? Distraction techniques, calming, breathing exercises, all those kind of things. So the idea was that the stuff that I was talking about in therapy with clients, they could then go back and reference that stuff, so that not taking notes in session, but then when they get home, I'm sure he said something about something, and then they can go online and look at that. And also just as a kind of a general resource to help people, just sort of tide people over so they can do some work at home. Because a lot of people, I think, with therapy, people often think with therapy, I'm not mad and therefore I don't need therapy. Whereas there's almost that interim stage. One, you can go down the pub and talk to your mates. Obviously, right now you can't. Yeah, well, you used to be able to talk to your mates or over a cup of coffee or something. But sometimes people need a little bit more than that. But they don't need to go and see a psychiatrist. They don't need to be heavily medicated. They don't need to be sectioned. And there's that kind of interim thing. If someone could just explain this to me. I do a lot of what we call psychoeducational work, which is explaining to people what's happening and why. And once people understand that, again, that metanoia moment of, oh, now I get it. And once they understand it, they're fine. So a lot of people don't always necessarily come for very long. But once they've understood why they're doing what they're doing, why they think the way they're thinking, often that's enough for people. And so the hope was that with those videos I put on the site, that would be a little bit psychoeducational. People would see it, they'd understand it, they think, oh, I get it now. Give them a few tools to deal with it. But at the same time, obviously, if it is more serious, like I said, there's a website, the website that I use. Again, there are other sites available, other service providers and all that business, but a thing called Counselling Directory, which if you Google that, and then you put in your postcode, or you might just say like telephone counselling or whatever, but that's a sort of a directory of counsellors in your area, and then you can book an appointment, go and see them, whatever, and talk to them about stuff.
Brilliant. I spend a lot of time as a pastor not trying to tell people of the efficacy and the benefit of therapy, and they feel like they're a failure, they're scared of it, watch too many movies, think it's an American thing, think it's a lack of faith, all those lots of things we talked about today. And I'll often say to them, look, the benefit of when you have a great conversation with someone and it makes you feel better. I go, it's just like a level above that with someone who knows how that works to help you have really good conversations. And then when they do it, they come back and they'll often go, oh, I wish I'd done that sooner.
Yeah. Well, I think, again, we talked about this on Monday, that often in Christian circles, there's a reservation, isn't there? I feel this sometimes as a therapist, that in Christian circles, if you say you're a therapist, there's almost like, oh, you work for the devil then. Because if you were a proper Christian, you just pray harder and then you'd be okay. Well, Jesus is my therapist and all this kind of stuff. And I just think, that's fair enough. And if that works for you, then God bless you. But for other people, it's that thing. But there is to me, there has been in the past a reluctance for Christians to get into therapy. And my own thing, there are Christian therapy organisations. There's the Association of Christian Counsellors, who are all explicitly Christian, although I think therapy is therapy, but they will obviously understand the mindset of Christians in the background, that kind of stuff. So if you're particularly, you want to see a Christian, that kind of stuff. So it's all out there, it's all available. Yeah.
Yeah. My a therapist I saw when I don't think I told you this, both my parents committed suicide 6 months apart from each other, and even I knew, I think I need to see a therapist. I went to see them straight away. They sort of like prophylactically, I'm here for whatever is about to unfold from this. And this therapist, she was a Christian, good therapist, and she said, is it important to you because you're a pastor that I'm a Christian? And I went, no, it's important for me that you're a good therapist. I said, the reason I want you as a Christian therapist is because I need you to understand something. I'm trying to become like someone else. And I said, and I need someone that understands that and doesn't think that that's a psychological condition. Jesus is who I'm trying to be like, as well as myself. That did make her laugh. So I sometimes think that's the benefit of a Christian therapist. They try to be Christ, try to become like Christ, and what that means.
I always say to people, I'm trying to become more like Jesus. I think I grew up trying to be like Jesus, and that's, as a perfectionist, that was an enormous rod to keep. So I always soften it by saying I like to be more like Jesus.
More like Jesus.
Give me a little bit of bend and.
All the things we struggle. I've never been. I might be a workaholic, but I've never suffered from perfectionism. I feel sorry for my friends. Right. So, and Peter, another resource. You sent me a thing called 25 Things to Do in a Lockdown.
Yes.
And is it okay if I put that online with a link to it?
Yeah, somebody sent that to me. I don't know who it's from. It was unless it says on the actual thing, but it was sent to me as something that we were allowed to use as a resource. It was sent out saying from I think the story is that it's a psychologist or somebody who'd sort of condensed the conversations he'd been having endlessly all day, every day, into 25 points, and then was just sending it out to people, and it got forwarded on. As far as I'm aware, yeah, please put it out, put it online. We've been doing that at our church, just one thing a day on the Facebook page over the first
brilliant
weeks. Just to overwhelm people, yeah.
So what's one good thing out of those 25? Which one pops into your head as a good one to remember?
I can't remember what they all were, those 25 things, but my advice to everybody is rule number 1, you must look after yourself. If you go under, it all goes under. So yes, you've got to look after your kids. Yes, you've got to look after your partner. Yes, you've got to look after your elderly parents. You've got to look after your flock. You've got to look after everyone and everybody else. However, rule number 1, you must look after yourself. If you don't look after yourself, then the whole thing falls apart.
Brilliant. And why don't we, because I'm assuming people watching this are going to be watching it because they're either thinking about how they help other people who are struggling, or they're struggling with things themselves. So I've started doing these interviews. Could you pray for the people that are watching? I'll pray with you. Pray as you are a therapist sitting on the forefront of all of this. It's been so good to talk to you today. You've got insight, wisdom, experience. Thank you in this wide-ranging interview. But yeah, close us out in prayer. That would be wonderful, Peter.
Yeah, so just Father of love, you are love. In your essence, you are love. And I just pray, Father, that you will draw close to anyone and everyone who sees this or who needs it. Just do that thing you do where you quicken our hearts and we become aware of your presence. Your great promise to us is that you are with us to the end of the age. And in all the madness and all the confusion and all the not knowing and the ambiguity, one thing that we can build our lives upon is you are with us. And I pray that people will just know it right down deep in their bones, that they will know that you are with us in all of this.
Oh, man. Oh, awesome. Thank you, Peter. Thank you for letting me grill you for all that period of time. And I suspect I might be back with a bunch of questions from people, but God bless you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
Yes, Jason. Thank you. Bye bye now.